Interesting.
Hello, my name's Andy Schmuckler. I'm here with my good and knowledgeable friend Scott Loomis. We'll be talking momentarily about where is the international order heading. This is our second go at it. And so our means is going to be to talk about something of what's been happening since we were last on together about a month ago. And to try to put that into a meaningful picture of the state of the play in the world that we're living in, whether we are comfortable in it or not. My main mission overall is what I call conveying a better human story, which has got to do with the whole challenge that our feces, not feces, but some of that too, our species has faced over the last 10 or 12,000 years. And it's at this moment, you can see, threatens to destroy us. So the better human story is about our being a species on a planet, and what's going on in the international order is an important part of where is this story of our species heading? Are we going to get our act together, or are we going to destroy ourselves? And of course, it's an enormously complex set of currents that are running around, and we'll talk about some of those. And Scott will be with us for between a half an hour and an hour. It probably depends entirely on his willingness to be generous with his time. And then after that, there will be other things which I will want to be offering to show in a meaningful way what it is that's happened to us as a species. And one of the topics is going to be called two social evolutionary developments that have empowered people to get their needs met, because civilization has not always been designed for the purpose of meeting human needs. And I got some juice about the importance of democracy and also the benefits of capitalism, which then I go on also to critique the market as a power system. And I'm very much into metaphors, and metaphors really sometimes allow you to, to use a word from the late 60s, grok the real meaning of something. And I've got three metaphors that I think help illuminate the human predicament. So, but let me turn now to our conversation with Scott Loomis, who, like me, has, but much more than I, has been professionally involved in the field of national security and things that are unfolding in the world in the effort to see that they unfold in a better way rather than the worst one. So, how would you like to open things up in terms of where is the international order heading in the context of recent developments?
Well, I guess I would start with a question. I mean, there's been a number of events in the last couple of weeks that have occurred. Which one kind of jumps out at you as being the most salient to be talked about? Because there's Ukraine, of course, there's Gaza, what's going on in with Putin's visit to Southeast Asia. There's also the elections in the EU and the upcoming elections. Which one kind of strikes you as most important?
I don't know that I can offer a judgment about the importance, but I can tell you that which ones do I have most feeling heading into?
That's what I know.
I'm reading these days that that the drums of war for between Israel and Hezbollah seem to be getting louder. I wouldn't have. I mean, there's been an exchange going on since October 8th or something. And it's always seemed like there was a consensus that Iran doesn't want this to become a big war. The Hezbollah doesn't want to go all out against Israel. Israel doesn't want the wider war. It all seemed like there was a consensus that they were going to be striking blows at each other, but it wasn't going to cross the threshold into, okay, now we're really at war. But now in the Israeli press, I've read, in the Jerusalem Post, I read an article last night that said it's in the process of it's coming, and I think that it's seen as an Israeli decision, but Hezbollah is definitely escalating and being provocative. So I think there's a lot at stake about whether that breaks out. I have no idea what would happen if it went all out, because Hezbollah's got over 100,000 missiles that it can send, overwhelming the Israeli defenses, and a number of them are precision. They can. We're not just talking about scaring people out of Kiryat Shimona in the north. We're talking about major targets being hit in Tel Aviv or Jerusalem.
Yeah.
That's a different situation.
Yeah. It's worrying. There's no question about it. And one of the questions that comes to mind is kind of who's pulling the strings for Hezbollah? Is that something they're doing on their own? What is the influence of Iran? What's Iran's motivation? What would they want, given that they've got elections coming up as well? And I don't know the answer to that, but I'm wondering is whether, and this is just occurring to me, is whether Iran is actually influencing this because they see the possibility of Hamas being hurt so badly in Gaza. They're trying to do things that allow Israel to withdraw troops from the Gaza Strip to the north, but not let it get so bad that it's actually a full-out war, because that would be devastating. I think it would be devastating for the region, and I believe that there would be people in Israel who would then strike supply depots, supply sources in Iran, and maybe Syria as well.
Just a lot of reporting that the Iranians don't want a wider regional war. Now, maybe that's changed. Um, but I don't see why it would have changed.
And I don't know. Do you think Hezbollah would act on its own?
Um, Not, I wouldn't think so. I mean, also, what's in it for Hezbollah? I mean, they may be able to do a lot of damage to the Israelis, but the Israelis have got an air force that can do whatever it wants in Lebanon, and there's no defense against a lot of what Israel can do, and they don't they don't need to have Israel look like a big bully or anything like that. Israel's already damaged itself so badly with the way they've dealt with the Hamas provocation. I mean, that's talk about Jews. I mean, that's the thing that just really bugs me, that the Israelis have committed a crime that was also a fantastic blunder. Thomas Friedman wrote a piece along those lines, and I've been saying it since December. But in any event, what has Iran got to gain to have a lot of damage done to Israeli targets, and Hezbollah basically obliterated as much as you can obliterate things in this day and age?
Yeah, no, I agree with you. And so it's kind of you wonder what's going on. You wonder if this is another blunder, if this is actually some sort of very clear strategy up to a point. I don't know the answer, but it's worrying, and it makes me wonder if whether the Israeli right is pushing this for some reason in ways I don't clearly understand.
I mean, I'm lifelong very pro-Israel, but this is the worst Israeli government
Ever.
ever, and qualitatively different. And it is a tragedy for the country that they had this fascistic gang in power at the time when Hamas would set the trap for them, and then they would just jump into it. So, it may be that there are people in the Netanyahu coalition that for some reason really don't like the sort of stalemate between themselves and Hezbollah, that like fascists in general, are interested in a drag out, knockdown fight,
I agree with that. I think that I believe that there are people on the right who have a vision of the greater Israel, which takes over Gaza, the West Bank, basically eradicates and removes Palestinians. They don't care where they go as long as it's not there, and that they have enough power given that Netanyahu. I mean, my interpretation, and of course I don't know him. I'm not an expert on Israeli politics, but he seems to be beginning to lose his focus and is saying all kinds of things. He's clearly saying things to influence U.S. domestic politics.
Well, I don't know if he's playing his cards poorly and losing his focus or not, but the disturbing thing is that the interests that are driving him are his own personal interests.
Oh,
He's like Trump that way, and that is so. That by itself tells you that you're dealing with a sociopath.
Well,
I mean, he in order to stay out of jail, does this sound familiar? He put people in he gathered a coalition big enough to hold on to power and stay out of jail by bringing into his coalition people who had always been shunned as extreme, as unwelcome, as beyond the pale in Israeli politics. But he was willing to do that if that's what it took.
Yeah. So here's a question for you. Do you think, the Israeli defense minister is in Washington, even as we speak. Do you think it's possible that the U.S. government would be beginning to work surreptitiously with Israeli members of the government to basically find a way to get rid of Netanyahu? They're working, diplomatically and even other ways to do that.
Well, I mean, I'm a big Biden fan, but he has really blown it with respect to playing the role of American president vis-a-vis the Israeli prime minister. I mean, he just blew it. I would have given Biden an A minus as president, maybe an A even, up until if you leave out that piece. But I mean, there's an article by I think it's David Ignatius, is a
I know
opinion
that.
cop, just couple days ago in the New York Times about how Biden kept on drawing these red lines, and Netanyahu has walked all over him without any consequences. Um, I don't understand what goes on with that.
Well, I
Is
mean,
he
we don't.
afraid of alienating the Jewish vote?
Well, I
Well,
don't
this
know.
is
I mean,
one Jewish vote that he alienated by not protecting Israeli and American interests better.
no, I don't disagree with that. And the question is, what's going on behind the scenes, if anything, that we don't see? Uh, or is simply Biden basically still living in the 1970s, 1980s in his view of Israel from those days? I don't know the answer to that, but I don't disagree with you on any
But
of the points.
there is I think the Biden group I mean, they know that Netanyahu's the problem. They know they've got going for them that the polls show that if the Israelis had a chance to vote, they would sweep him and his gang out of power.
Right.
It's been clear since the beginning of the Gaza crisis. But nonetheless, there is no need to call an election until what is it, 2020? Anyway, it's a long way off.
It's a year at least now.
And the fascists on the right, like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, they hold him hostage.
Indeed.
They say, if you don't invade Rafah,
Right.
then we will leave the coalition, and then you lose your majority, and then there are going to be elections. That's probably a bluff because there's no way they ever get back in the government if there are new elections. But they seem to hold Netanyahu hostage. But
That's
there is
right.
a chance. There are fractures. Some people are talking about that there are scenarios that are plausible, not necessarily likely, that Netanyahu government could fall in the coming months. And the Biden people would be remiss if they weren't spending a lot of time. How do we help that to happen?
Well, that's my point. I mean, so if you're a U.S. diplomat and you're all of a sudden going to somebody to talk to certain key Likud members and say, hey, just on the QT, if you withdraw from this government, we can help you with other things. Um, Starting to have those kind of conversations that encourage these people to leave the government so that there is an election with the promise that there would be something in it for them. Could you imagine the political people doing that?
I would hope they'd be doing it.
Yeah.
But there's other stuff. I mean, Benny Gantz, the guy who apparently would become prime minister if this government fell and there were an election. That's what the polls say now. He left that unity government,
Right.
and I gather that there is a way that people can precipitate an election without the prime minister or the ruling coalition calling for it. I don't remember what the mechanism is, but if you can get a majority of the Knesset behind some kind of maneuver with
Right.
that the rules allow, you can precipitate an election. It's sort of like what do we call it in the House of Representatives? The way to bring something to the floor without the speaker's permission. What's the name of that thing?
Oh, I'm blanking. I know what you
Discharge
mean. Yeah.
discharge petition.
Yeah, that's right. Discharge petition. Yeah.
So I mean, so you could have American diplomats talking with Benny Gantz, and we have had American diplomats talking with Benny Gantz, and we maybe played a role in encouraging him to give that June 8th ultimatum. If you don't come up with a plan, Mr. Prime Minister, I'm leaving this unity government. Americans might have played a role in that, and that's fine with me.
It'll be interesting to watch how this plays out up to and past the convention, the Democratic convention, because at some point the need for election dynamics to take and play a role in the international relations with Israel may become pretty strong. I mean, it might be in the Democrats and the Biden administration's interest to get some sort of resolution to get Netanyahu out of there for election purposes, because right now there are so many younger people apparently who are so dissatisfied with the U.S. role here that they're not going to vote. They wouldn't vote for Trump, but they're just not going to vote.
See, how many stick with it. I mean, a lot of people, I've been through a lot of election things over the last 60 years or whatever. Uh, People say things and get angry and stuff like that. But as election day approaches and they contemplate, am I really going to do
That's the
nothing?
alternative. Yeah.
Am I really going to do nothing to prevent Donald Trump from ending American democracy? I think there's going to be they may feel one way about Biden, but that on one issue compared to the sort of universal catastrophe Donald Trump is representing himself as offering us.
Yeah, no, you may be right. I mean, that's my
I
hope
hope
too.
so.
Yeah, but limited uh, information I have and people I've talked to, I have a friend who Jewish also, retired, um, and she's been working with the Muslim community, mostly on climate change for some time. And she was telling me a couple weeks ago at lunch how deeply searing this issue is emotionally for the Muslim, and I mean, so they're
For
beyond
who? For who did you say?
the
For who?
Muslim community.
Oh, I see.
Yeah,
Yeah,
because so it means so that the scars are so deep that they might not do what's in their best interest. It's
yeah,
basically,
and Biden, I think, could have prevented a lot of that by separating himself as soon as it became evident that Netanyahu was going to take the money and the weapons and ignore the advice. As soon as that happened, there was nothing. In fact, I was very impressed with Biden's opening moves in this whole thing. The way he embraced Israel. I mean, there were signs in Tel Aviv, "Thank you, Mr. President," and stuff
right,
like
right.
that. He established a standing of as an American president as so much the friend of Israel that it gave him the standing to say, be careful, don't do the excesses that we did after 9/11 and all various things that he said. And he could have used that standing, but so he made him a blunder for months, and it may cost him Michigan. My guess is my guess is that a good Democratic campaign would win Michigan by enough that losing all those votes in Dearborn, Michigan, from Arab Americans won't swing the state. That's what I would bet. But there is a danger.
Yeah, I mean, it's. I never was very good at betting anyway. Just to let you know. And
Oh, I was looking forward to our publicly laying money down on various predictions.
oh boy, uh, yeah, it's interesting. I mean, well, we can get into that later, but let's go back to the original point about what's going on there. I mean, so very clearly, what's happening with Gaza and Israel has implications for the U.S. election. No question about that.
Yeah.
It has implications broader. I mean, particularly if there's some sort of wider war that breaks out, if there is some kind of unexpected strike by either Hezbollah or by the Israelis, and um, that could take things in a whole different way that we don't, don't anticipate. And who knows? Who knows?
I'm sure behind the scenes, Vladimir Putin, who's buddies with the Iranians, those governments must be talking. Vladimir Putin wants Trump to win.
Oh yeah, of course.
And I don't think it's a casual desire on his part.
You know, like he's putting money into misinformation or something like that.
No, I'm thinking, I think you could count on Putin to encourage the Iranians to get Hezbollah to do stuff that would be injurious to Joe Biden before the election.
Oh yeah, absolutely. But
the wider war doesn't help Biden.
Yeah. So what would happen if the Israelis hit the Russian base in Syria?
Well, why would they do that?
Why wouldn't they? I mean, they
Well,
let's
they
say
don't want to provoke the. They got enough. What they need to go up against the Russians too. I
well,
mean,
let's say
go
the
ahead.
Iranians are shipping Hezbollah missiles through that base. That becomes a major logistic hub.
Oh, oh. Well, if the if the weapons are being used by Hezbollah,
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. Well, the Israelis have been hitting targets in Syria for a long time,
Right.
and they will hit any target they know about that threatens them. Yeah, they'll do that. But I think that you were talking about Biden being hurt by this, and of course the Biden people have been pressing for a ceasefire, doing everything they could, you know, strong arming the people of Qatar. You get Hamas on board, but
Right.
then Hamas ends up saying no to
Right.
the exact same terms that that had proposed
I know.
a couple of weeks ago. And I think that the American policy is based on the assumption that there's something in it for Hamas to get a ceasefire. I think Hamas thinks that Hamas and Netanyahu unfortunately agree on one thing: the continuation of the war is in their interest.
I agree with that. I agree with that. So, what do you think of Friedman's article? Did you see it in the Post? I think, or in the New York Times about a week ago, where he basically said that what Israel should do is they should accept the ceasefire. They should basically say it's a permanent ceasefire. They should let Hamas essentially try and take control and let the Palestinian people basically deal with Hamas. I think the premise is it's up to the Palestinian people to get rid of Hamas. And his view was that they will look at what's happened in Gaza, they'll look at Hamas trying to deal with it, and they will reject them. Did you read that article in the opinion
I
piece?
did. I don't remember those details as well as you just presented them. It's clear that there. I mean, one of the things I've always wondered is if you had a very very wise group in Israel on October 8th, what would they have done? Something very different, but I don't know what it is. But at this point, Israel's just hurting itself.
Right,
Uh,
I agree.
I mean, I think that's crystal clear. I don't know how many Israelis do or don't recognize that. The Israelis seem to be in a very disappointing frame of mind. That's another thing that I've got a fair amount of juice to. Is that I'm disturbed to see how much the Israeli people, while they've got a lot of energy to protest not getting the hostages back, there doesn't seem to have been a groundswell about let's not do this thing that we're doing to the civilians of Gaza. It's not right and it's not smart and all that. It seems as though they've gotten themselves into a frame of mind where I think a big majority of Israeli people, 68%, basically approve of how the war is being conducted.
Yeah.
And I don't understand quite. I guess trauma might do that to you.
Well, I think trauma and the ghosts of pogroms and the Holocaust have come to life for them in a real way.
Yeah, I come from that background.
I know.
I'm two generations removed from the pogroms.
Yeah.
And my family culture includes stories that were I heard, as a little kid, that gave me goose flesh about, dead bodies and such.
Well,
So I kind of understand that, but I'm very far from getting so triggered, which I think must have happened there in a collective kind of way, so triggered that you can't think straight, that you can't ask yourself, well, let's see, what do we want to accomplish? What is the strategy best likely to accomplish that whole set of values that we've got at stake? Like our standing in the world being not of no value.
yeah. Yeah. And I don't know the answer to that. It'll be interesting to see how it plays out. But I want to pivot a little bit because there's other things going on in the world, and you
Yeah.
clearly have a lot of energy around Israel and Gaza. But I'd be curious to hear your reaction to Putin's visit to North Korea and what that entails for for the larger international order.
Yeah, maybe you can explain some stuff to me. Uh, I mean, Putin is he's the most destructive enemy that we've got, um, in my assessment. Um, he's not as powerful as Xi in China, and that may yet turn out to be the big nightmare. But I see Xi as less of a monster, um, more driven by uh, rational calculation and careful assessment. I used to think that Putin was really a great chess player too, but he blundered so much in Ukraine. I think he's exposed something about himself that makes me very worried about him. So I'm concerned that even though I think he's really dealt himself a disastrous blow with his miscalculations in Ukraine, he still seems to be able to bring a lot back. You know, it's a little Cold War like. I'm hearing that a lot of countries in Africa, and this is where I'm hoping you've got insight that I ain't got. A lot of countries in Africa are sort of siding with Russia on Ukraine. Why would they be doing that?
Well, I think there's mixed opinion. I mean, it depends on which country you're talking about. Um, my reading of that is that there's this long-standing resentment towards the colonial powers, and the Western powers who, in their view, have been preaching one thing and doing other things, and so there's a little bit of tweaking the nose of the colonial powers. And I think they're also looking at the future and saying, this is going to be a multipolar world. It's not clear to us where we're going to get our best advantages. Is it going to be with India? Is it going to be with China? Is it going to be with the West? And they're kind of hedging their bets.
Jump in with a quick question.
Mm-hmm.
I hear that that some of our enemies, including China, or competitors, let's just call them for the moment, like China, there's talk about they don't like the West's rule-based order. And here we could talk about the international order. That they're interested in bringing it down, or at least challenging it, or providing an alternative or something. Is this order that they're talking about? Is it stack the deck? I mean, is there some kind of colonial power game going on with the West having this rules-based order? I've always thought that the basic rules-based international order is sort of good for everybody. Am I wrong?
Yes, you are.
Well, good. I get to learn something.
I
So
don't
it
think
does
I
stack
don't
the deck.
I don't think it's seen that way in the South. I think it's
You mean
seen,
like in Alabama and Mississippi?
well, maybe that as well. But Ben Rhodes, who's an interesting character, just wrote
Yeah,
in
I like
Foreign
him.
Affairs that basically the rules-based order is gone, and we need to accept the reality that that no longer exists, and that we're in a period. He didn't say it this way, but a period of transition to something else that we don't know, quite understand. Um, and,
What is I mean, isn't the rules-based order got things like every country owns up to 200 miles or something from its shore? Uh,
well, yeah,
doesn't it mean that that sea lanes will be kept open? Um, doesn't it mean that you're not supposed to do what Putin did to Ukraine? I mean, isn't everybody for all that stuff?
no,
Why not? What do
because
you want?
it's not in their
Do you want
interest.
fights like in the Philippines, where the
Yeah, yeah.
Chinese are elbowing in?
Well, I think what the South is saying is that the West basically says one thing, but we're seeing lots of examples where major countries, countries that actually have helped us, like China, are doing different things and getting away with it. And so they're hedging their bets. I mean, I think there's a little bit like going back to the non-aligned period of the 60s and 70s. This is, I'm just thinking about this, and it's really, we're going through a transition period from the rules-based order, which for a lot of us was historically good for everyone, to something different. And
I still don't see how it's not in everybody's interest. I mean, give me a rule. Give me a rule that the West has put out into the world that benefits the West at the expense of the South.
Well, I think they would say that, not interfering in other people's politics and not understanding, invading other countries. The West invaded Iraq and
oh, we violated the rules, but that's different. I mean, our being hypocrites is one thing, but wanting to bring down the rules-based order, I don't know who that serves. What rule?
Well, I think, you asked me what the South is, and I think what they're doing is they're saying, we're seeing all these violations by very powerful people, and they're getting away with it. And so do the rules-based orders work anymore? And where do we get, we need to do things for our country, for our political elites, whatever it may be. Where do we put our resources for the future to be able to make sure that we're better off? And so I think there's a lot of waiting and seeing. I think if you talk to some of the interesting thing you may remember after the invasion a couple of years ago, the Kenya delegate to the United Nations made a very quite stirring speech. Do you remember that?
No.
No, he basically he came out against the invasion, and he basically said the argument that Russia is using is about imperial requirements, imperial historical requirements that don't make sense, because Africa was formed kind of arbitrarily. And that doesn't mean that we can, invade each other's countries, because if we do that, if we accept what Russia says, we can basically start changing the boundaries all over the continent. And so he was accepting the rules-based order. He was much more articulate than I could ever be. And I'm wondering, I don't know, I'm not as connected to the South as I was a few years ago, that people are just basically saying the power dynamics are changing, and therefore the rules are changing. And we're going to wait and see where this all plays out, quite frankly, to see how.
Let me this was my big picture, if you will indulge me for a couple minutes.
I always indulge you.
Well,
by the way, for folks out there, his name is Andy, not Aaron.
Okay, that's my firstborn son, and I can't. The problem, at the heart of the problem for our species has been that we took a step out of the natural order and found ourselves in a situation where there was no order to govern how the various societies would interact. Very different from the biologically evolved order. And as a result of that, there was a war of all against all. And that has been the source of a huge amount of the brokenness of the human world for 10,000 years. So to me, I think that the challenge we face is to put our civilization in a good order so that we can survive on this planet for the long haul, because we can see that one of the alternatives, a very real alternative, is that we're going to destroy ourselves as human civilization. So this question of we were talking about, why are the Africans siding with Russia on the Ukraine war? That is such a crucial kind of a rule that, and it really benefits the weak much more than the strong. I mean, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That's what happens in the world when you don't have the right rules in place. But the weak, like Ukraine, get to be the victims of the strong if you don't have that rule. So if I'm Africa, I'm going to say, Yeah, we've experienced what happens when the strong come in, the imperial powers of Europe. That's not the way the world should operate. What Putin's doing to Ukraine is an example of what shouldn't happen. That's how it seems to me. The only thing that I have in my head about explaining with the Africans is I gather that a lot of French West African nations have been had coups in which pro-Western governments have been replaced by pro-Russian governments, and maybe is Putin having some way of engineering these coups?
Well, I don't know. He certainly has influenced them, no question about it. I mean, I believe, I don't know this, and is that there has been money exchange, basically promises around power uh, with the militaries who've overthrown these governments. Um, so a couple points. One is that I think that Russia sees it in their interest. The military elites see it in their interest. But basically, the Islamic jihadists see it in their interest too, because they're gaining in all these cases. Where the so by like in Mali, where the military has had a coup, the insurgents, the militant insurgents are making great gains. This is also the case in other countries. It is without across the board, the fight against the Islamists is being lost as a result of these coups. I want to go back to the point, and I realize there's a premise in one of your statements that I'm not sure is true, and that is I'm not sure how many African countries don't support this. If there's a few that supported Russia. I mean, South Africa is the big one. Uh, but I think if you look at the number of countries who actually either have supported Ukraine, and they're not very powerful, and they're not very vocal, is actually more than the people that haven't.
So how many? Well, I'll tell you what my source is, Scott.
Okay.
April was listening to the news on NPR, and she came down. And she, I was just hearing an article about all these African countries that are supporting Russia on the issue of Ukraine. So that's all I know.
Yeah, I think that's probably not quite accurate. I think that there's been a couple of votes um, in different conferences in the General Assembly where the numbers have changed since the official invasion. The number of African countries who have supported the Western view has gone down, but I think the majority of African countries still support Ukraine. Now, is is Kenya as important as South Africa? What about Nigeria and Sudan? Does it even exist? Uh, I mean, so it's kind of
It's a mixed picture.
it's a mixed picture, and I think we need to be careful when we say all of Africa because that is
Yeah, I
totally
appreciate the
inaccurate.
correction. I don't. I got the sense of a groundswell, but just to underscore how I think it is really in terms of where is the international order heading. I think that the more the Ukrainians succeed and the more they make Putin a failure, the better for where the international order is heading. Uh, Putin Putin seems to have become a smart operator again. He seems to be able to build from very bad position. And you ask about the North Koreans. He's forming. He's got the Chinese somewhat associated with him. He's got the North Koreans deeply in bed with him. The Iranians giving him all those drones. He's creating his own sort of network of power. So he's building back up. But I think
We should call it the axis of evil.
yeah, I was. It's okay with me. Tell you the truth,
Okay.
because what they're standing for is definitely the worst. I mean, not that our side is always the good ones, but I mean, not that we're perfect or complete, completely altruistic, but just like in World War II, it it's good for the world for the UK and the US to have defeated the Nazis.
Yeah, yeah.
We're in that situation essentially right now.
Yeah, it's interesting. I'm to be very curious, and I haven't heard much reporting. I really am curious about hearing the Chinese reaction to Putin going to North Korea and having this alliance.
Well, is that would that be worrisome to the Chinese?
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, China has been the sort of the protector of sorts of North Korea.
Well, protector, but also keeping it within a certain. I mean, trying
Yeah,
to keep it under control, and
right.
having another party coming in and kind of influencing what the North Koreans might do. I mean, particularly if they get technology that allows them to cause even more havoc with South Korea, or God forbid, in someplace like Guam. Um, the Chinese wouldn't want that. They want to be able to have control over the North Koreas, and
Stability on the Korean Peninsula.
yeah. I mean, but also importantly, and it doesn't get as much news as Putin went to Vietnam. The
Yeah,
Chinese and Vietnamese do not have a good relationship. I mean,
surprising to a lot of
Americans who had simple-minded things about communism, the Chinese and the victorious North Koreans fought a war of sorts very
no,
briefly
North
in
Vietnamese.
1979.
It was the North Vietnamese, not North Koreans. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I meant the North
Yeah,
Vietnamese.
right. You're exactly right. I mean, so if I'm China watching this, I'm not totally comfortable with what's going on. And so there's going to be, I think it's going to be really key to watch what the Chinese do in the next few months as we becomes clear what this visit and the agreements, what they yield. I mean, so that'll be really interesting to watch from my perspective.
What do you think? Keep an eye on what the Chinese might do. What they do? I mean, what's to do?
Well, I think that's a good question. Whether they start putting certain kinds of pressures on the North Koreans. I mean, they can always cut off certain flows of equipment and so on because a lot of it has to travel through China. I can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
The United States put a lot of pressure on China early in the war not to be, to stay out. Not to be a supporter of Putin in that situation, which was just a few weeks after Xi and Putin embraced as forever friends or whatever that was. So how much are the Chinese actually holding back from supporting Putin? And how much are they? I know that they're doing some things that are helpful to Putin.
Right.
How much?
Well, I mean, that's a good question. And from what I've read, and of course I don't have any insight into intelligence or anything, is that there's a lot of basic materials that are still going that are not military bias, but chips are going that they can use those to be used in military hardware, ball bearings. I mean, certain things that the Russians have been getting from Europe are now being produced in China and shipped. So from an economic point of view,
The Americans said to the Chinese, "Don't do such and such." Is this within the okay, or is this violating what we told them? They would there would be consequences if they
no, I think
helped Russia.
I think we told them, as we watch you do this, there's going to be consequences. So the interesting thing, and I was reading, there are certain banks in China who are stopping their financial transactions with Russia because they're under threat of sanctions now, new sanctions. And so you're seeing some change. And this has been in the last 2 weeks. So I think there's still more to be said about this. Uh, I mean, part of what Putin did is an act of desperation. He needs the artillery shells, basically.
Some desperation, it seems, on the Russian side.
Yeah. And it's so I think this is a moving chessboard that you can't always foresee what the consequences are going to be. That's why I think watching what China does is going to be kind of interesting over the next couple of months from a very clinical point of view.
To say in terms of the question from long ago, like what do I have some juice for? We talked a lot about Gaza, but we're not talking so much about Ukraine. But I think it's important at least to notice, and if you're up to it, discuss. I'm getting a clear impression that thanks to the break of the logjam that the pro-Putin wing of the Republican Party in the House created about aid to Ukraine, so the Ukrainians were falling back
with the Russians advancing. That has been reversed now. I think that the movement on the battlefield, and I don't know how far this is going to be, but it's more and more you're hearing things about a little bit of Ukrainian advance and about striking targets very effectively in Russian-controlled territory, and including even within Russia itself. So I think that the war, which was going well for a while, and then the Ukrainians started losing ground, partly because of those Republicans in the House,
Yeah.
and now it looks to me like the momentum is in the direction of I don't know if how far the Ukrainian advance can go, but it would be great if they could actually defeat Putin, like looked possible a year and a quarter ago.
Yeah, I mean, from what I've been reading, a couple of things. One is they've halted advances in the north. They've taken a few villages back. The Russians are still making incremental gains in the Donbass area. I mean, every time you look at the news, there's another village has fallen or a tactical advance. So the Russians have been successful in drawing forces away from the Donbass to the north to protect it. The weapons that have coming in and the ammunition has helped stabilize the situation.
Do you think the Russians are in better shape than I was characterizing?
Well, I think the Russians are not in better shape than they were a month ago, but I don't know that it's turning the tide of the war at all. Now, the difference is that the control of the Black Sea. I mean, the naval war has been all Ukrainian. I mean, the Black Sea fleet doesn't really exist for Russia anymore.
It's the way they've been able to strike at targets in Crimea.
Right, and they're doing.
My sense of the overall battlefield has been that there's been more good news than bad.
Well, I think what we're hearing is true. I mean, I think that's right. I agree with that. And so you get a sense that there has been a change in momentum. There's a lot more. There's a lot to go. I mean, the Ukrainians are suffering from manpower issues. The Russians are able to conscript, tens of thousands of people, throw them into the battlefield. A lot of them get killed or wounded, and then they conscript another 50,000.
Treat them.
So I don't know how this is going to go. It'll be interesting to see. I mean, I would like to see a breakthrough. I'd like to see the Russian front collapse like it did in World War One, but who knows?
Yeah, there were some revolutions in Moscow, but
well, I've only got another 5-10 minutes, Andy, but I wanted to bring up the topic that you and I talked about briefly, and that is the elections in the EU and the subsequent elections that are going to take place in France here, starting I think this weekend. What does that mean for the larger world order? What are the motivations behind some of these election results?
a lot of elections, and I would say the most important uncertainty with respect to where is the international heading in these times, the biggest uncertainty has to do with the outcome of the American presidential election. That is a huge fork in the road with respect to where is the internet. So,
Yep.
And we've had other elections since you and I spoke, besides the European Union ones that the right made a big gain in. There's also an election in, say India, where the semi-fascist Hindu nationalist party that was talking about getting up to 400 and some seats and got an amazingly low, considering the expectations, 230 or something like that.
Yeah, much lower than that. Yeah.
And so they can't govern by themselves anymore. And so the flame of democracy in India got a little brighter, maybe more than a little brighter as a result of that election.
Well, I would also mention South Africa.
Yeah, so where the ANC, which had become, I guess, pretty messed up. No, not a Nelson Mandela's ANC. For the first time, didn't get a majority since the end of apartheid. It didn't get a majority, and so they had to make a choice to form a coalition. And people talked about they could go left with some black parties that you could say might have been not a good part of the solution to South Africa's problems. At least that's the view. Or they could go right to a party that's sort of centrist right a little bit, and mostly and dominated by white people. And they went to the latter.
Right, that's right. That's correct.
Which people I read regarded as good news. And it's been kind of disappointing to an idealist like me to see that you can end apartheid and then end up with me wondering 30 years later or whatever, has that benefited? Has that led to something better than what there was before? I don't know. Maybe that's a stupid question, but I don't know the answer to that.
Well, that's a longer conversation. Let's hold that conversation for that's one that we could spend.
Well, is it a legitimate question, or is it obvious that it was? I mean, I
No,
appalled.
it is a question, but the answer is really complicated, I think.
Okay, all right. Well, we can go there or not go there, but I often do wonder sometimes when good things happen, do they actually lead to good things happening? The freeing of Rhodesia. When Rhodesia became Zimbabwe with that guy Mobutu on, that became appalling. I would have much rather have lived in British colonial Rhodesia than Mobutu's Zimbabwe. It's so disappointing when the good things don't lead to good outcomes.
Well, there you go. I mean, so maybe that's a good place for us to pause. It's like, how come good things don't lead to good outcomes in the long term?
Yeah, why can't we engineer the world we want?
That's right. That's what I have to say. Well, our agreement is to talk not quite an hour, and we're at that point, and I actually have something here in a few minutes I have to do otherwise. I hate to say there's other things besides you that are important to me.
Well, yeah, but are they more important than the international order? I mean,
yeah, of all things.
It doesn't get much bigger than that. Yeah. All right.
Anyway,
well, thank you very much for giving of your time, and I look forward to the next time we sort of check out what the developments are.
Well, it'll be interesting because it'll be post-French elections, we'll have a lot to talk about.
And the British elections, where it looks like
too.
The Conservatives are almost to be put onto the ash heap of history by present polls. But
yeah,
all right.
You're right.
All right. Be well, son.
All right. Take care. Bye-bye.
That was fun for me. I hope it was interesting for you. So we've got other topics, which I'll put out there again to show what's still on the menu. We're going to talk, I guess, first about some metaphors of the human predicament. I think metaphors are very powerful things. Sometimes I think that the metaphor may actually be the way we understand in some sense, the deepest realities of the universe. But I don't feel equipped at the moment to go down that avenue. And just give the example of 3 metaphors that I think are useful for showing what some reality at the core of the human story. My version of the human story, which I say puts important things in a wholly different light, like how to understand our nature, how to understand why the world is the way it is and why our history is the way it is, and how to understand what the challenges are we face. That all that gets illuminated in important new ways if you look at the consequences of a species and stepping onto the path of civilization. Seen in an evolutionary perspective, this is an enormously consequential breakout, and people haven't, it sort of has floored me for a number of years how little attention people have paid to the consequences a species taking an unprecedented step and creating an unprecedented situation. Well, that unprecedented situation is one where there's no order to govern the interactions of this new life form, which has not been created by a natural selection, but invented by a species that has a level of creative intelligence that no other species had. It followed for hundreds of thousands of years, maybe a couple million if you want to go far back, in developing culture as a way of adorning its basically primate way of living, but then breaks out and starts to invent a whole different way of life with gardening and herding and eventually agriculture, new kinds of political organization, all kinds of stuff. And all these societies that are emerging in this fashion are going to be dealing with each other outside of any order, which isn't the way it is in the biologically evolved order. And I often say the lion and the zebra and the grass work together to create a perpetual motion machine, even as they devour each other. But civilized societies are in this state of anarchy, which leads to a war of all against all. And so these societies are devouring each other. Inevitably, not because of the nature of the creature, but because of the systemic force, where a war of all against all inevitably generates a selective process where, though you have a whole variety of ways of having a human society that's crossed onto that path, only some of them are well equipped to survive and prevail on a war of all against all. That's just the systemic nature of things. It has nothing to do with whether this creature is by nature aggressive and domineering or if it's pacifistic. There's going to be a diversity of forms, and out of this war of all against all, only the ways of power are going to shape the direction in which that creature's civilization will evolve. That's what I claim to prove in the book, which is the foundation of my Better Human story. Let's see, let me show you the book. I'll be reading from it, just a little passage in a minute. Present, cover. So that's where my life's work started. And it basically shows that the step onto the path of civilization inevitably unleashes a destructive force. Or if you don't have to describe it in terms of destruction, but you can see how I can show that basically it's a very mixed bag at best. It selects for whatever kinds of cultural options, and that goes with economic systems, political systems, psychological structure, whatever kind of cultural options lead to prevailing in a war of all against all. That is not random. It is predetermined that societies will be driven in that direction. What I call, I say, inevitably there emerges a destructive force that gives the spirit of the gangster, which is what prevails in a war of all against all, a disproportionate voice in how the human world is going to be operated. So stepping onto the path of civilization appears to be a breakthrough into freedom, but it turns out it's not. It can be shown that it's not. It's inevitably stepping onto into a disordered situation, which generates its own systemic force that drives things in a predetermined direction. And you can see that wherever, in the 6 places on the planet where civilizations emerged from hunting-gathering peoples in the Nile Valley and the Tigris, Euphrates, and the other 4, and over thousands of years, eventually coming up with cities and empires and tyrannies and enslavements. Pretty much the same selection for the same basic kinds of things. Wherever the experiment was conducted, I think that's pretty telling. But the logic shows why it was inevitable. So anyway, to get to the human predicament, one of the metaphors that I like for this, because it captures something that I think if we're going to understand what's happened to our species, it's not just about what humans have done. It's about the field of forces within which we've operated, in which we've had to make the choices that we've made. And Oscar Wilde wrote this sort of fable of a magnet, which I'll read a bit of, much of. Once upon a time, there was a magnet, and in its close neighborhood lived some steel filings. One day, 2 or 3 little filings felt a sudden desire to go and visit the magnet. And they began to talk of what a pleasant thing it would be to do. Other filings nearby overheard their conversation, and they too became infected with the same desire. Still others joined them, till at last all the filings began to discuss the matter, and more vague desire grew up into an impulse. Why not go today, said some of them, but others were of the opinion that it would be better to wait until tomorrow. Meanwhile, without their having noticed it, they began involuntarily moving closer to the magnet, which lay there quite still. I'll skip a bunch here because I think you can see what. Then at the end, the whole group of them gets, with one irresistible impulse, the whole body cried out, "There is no use waiting. We will all go today. We will go now. We will go at once." And then on one unanimous mass, they swept along, and another moment were clinging fast to the magnet on every side. The magnet smiled, for the steel filings had no doubt at all but that they were paying that visit with their own free will. Now, the personification of the magnet is not the part of the metaphor that I like here for as a way of encouraging the people I'm trying to reach with this Better Human Story to open your mind to an image of what would it mean if, while human beings have been acting for thousands of years, there's been some kind of a force at work in their world that so compels them in certain directions that it is that force that's determining where they're going to end up, not their own choice. And when I present the ideas in that book, The Parable of the Tribes, and since then, when I've articulated in briefer forms, I often say, driven in a direction that they did not choose but could not avoid. So it captures that aspect of what's happened to our species. I say, for example, that any creature on any planet, anywhere in the cosmos, that, like our species on this planet, steps onto the path of civilization by extricating itself from the niche in which it evolved biologically. And I'm assuming, they've evolved biologically, they've emerged to a point, and that they're able to invent their own way of life, and that they do that, and they extricate themselves from their original niche. That any creature that does that is going to find itself swept up into a social evolutionary process that drives how it develops in ways that are not a function of its nature or of its choice, but are mandated by this kind of disorder into which they've plunged themselves. And no blame here, by the way. I mean, I think it can be said with almost certitude. I'm willing to, not that I know you know, there's no way I could know this, but I'm willing to bet that if you look back at all of our ancestors, from the time that we were hunter-gatherers, living in the niche in which we evolved biologically, all the way up to the emergence of full-blown civilization, cities, and armies, and tyrannies, and all that stuff, that nobody ever understood themselves to be participating in a process where something very new was emerging. I doubt that the people who planted the first little gardens thought that they were. I'm imagining that somebody, oh, that's a good idea. I'll take the seeds, and and those goats that we've been hunting. Maybe we can, put a couple of them in a pen, see, breed them or something like that. People probably had I got a creative idea here, but the idea that they were creating something really new, and that they had unleashed something that was going to drive them in directions that they did not choose but could not avoid. I bet nobody ever thought that way in any meaningful way. I mean, people probably would. Well, if we do this, will that interfere with our picnics? I don't know what they would have thought, but the changes always would have been minor. There is a book I read in the process of researching the parable of the tribes called 4,000 Years Ago by a guy, and I think the name was Jeffrey Bibby. And I believe I have one quote from him in my book, which is basically that what I was saying, that nobody perceived themselves as being part of any process of change. To them, it was so much the same as it had been in the world into which they were born, that's just the way the world is. And that's why the evolutionary perspective is really so important. If you're just looking at the world you were born into and the changes that occur while you're, which were very, very, very slow for thousands of, generations and generations, very, not like what we've got now, and even now. But if you take the big picture, and then you can identify what crucial changes there have been, that you create a situation which generates a force that, like that magnet, pulls people in a direction that these people think that they're choosing of their own free will, but are really, really part of what their creativity inadvertently subjected them to. And then we come to another metaphor that I've been using lately, and it's one of my own metaphors, and I think it's a way of addressing a problem that I find that there is in people's thinking, which is that it seems that people have difficulty recognizing how the dynamics of the whole are not necessarily explicable in terms of the dynamics of the parts. I've talked about people who take my theory, say they're enthusiastic, but then indicate that they're thinking that I'm talking about human psychology, and I'm not. I'm talking about the consequences of disorder. And I use the metaphor lately of trampling. There's a nightclub in New York City, in Manhattan, I believe, in the 1920s, where a fire broke out. And the doors opened inward. So everybody panics. Everybody streams toward the doors. And with all the pressure pushing the people that are up against the doors, there's no way of opening the doors. And a huge number of people died a lot of them trampled to death. And then I compare that with the non-trample approach, which has got to do with fire drills, like we had as kids in school back in my day. And I assume that, I mean, we didn't have shooter drills, but we had what in case there's an atomic explosion nearby, how to protect ourselves from the glass. And we had fire drills and we practiced them every, a couple times a year, maybe, to make sure that if the time comes that we're in a situation like in that nightclub in New York City, we will be orderly. We will operate in a way that's been pre-designed with certain goals in mind. The well-ordered system doesn't lead to people being trampled. The disordered system does. And it doesn't have to do with the that, like in maybe some office building, so we have adults be comparing adults with adults. I mean, I don't know, I've been in 1800 K Street when there was some kind of a fire alarm, and people filed out of that multi-story office building in downtown DC in a very orderly way. But I don't remember ever having drills, but I guess people basically understand what a fire drill is. But people in that nightclub didn't understand some orderly way of proceeding, and they died as a consequence. And that captures that it's not human nature that makes the war of all against all that couldn't be prevented. That's the kind of fire that that breaks out. This war of all against all, and there is no pre-ordered way of dealing with how societies are going to interact. So the societies basically trample each other. And that book, The Parable of the Tribes, uses that to explain not everything about the human history, but some very major things that lead to the conclusion, by the way, that the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large, which is another one of my favorite lines. I mean, I bet if we had a movie of what happened in that nightclub, people would be talking about, look at that ugliness. Look at the willingness of that man to push that woman out of the way and trample her, trying to get himself out so he can survive. Yeah. If he'd been at 1800 K Street and knew how to vacate that building when the alarm goes off, he wouldn't have seemed so ugly. Certain situations give people only a certain set of options. Kill or be killed is basically an important part of what's been operative in the interactions among societies. I mean, it's not all that bad, but a whole lot of it is that bad. A lot of the destiny of civilization is decided not on the basis of, geez, what would be best for people? Thinking about the United States, I'm a American patriot in many, many ways. Because our society's being set up was one of the major steps forward in the history of humankind. It's a real breakthrough of a consequential kind. I love that. And I'll be talking more about that in the next topic about two social evolutionary developments that have empowered people to get their needs met. The American Constitution is connected with one of those two. Well, let's see, where was I? We need to order our civilization because there's a force at work that we didn't choose. The ugliness that we see is a function of what everybody gets faced with when it's a war of all against all. I often use the example of Lebanon and 40 some years ago, or Somalia 30 couple years ago, two places where there was anarchy and a consequent war of all against all, and the emergence of warlords that basically controlled how things were, or if not completely controlled, I mean, they were still at war with each other in both those situations. But having a disproportionate say, and that's just another metaphor. I mean, well, it's not a metaphor. It's really kind of the same thing. When you get an empire emerging in the Mesopotamia, the Tigris, Euphrates, and you get all these different names of empires that arose in that part of the world over several thousands of years. I don't even remember Akkadian, what the first of those empires. Eventually you've got the Persian Empire. You got in the Nile Valley, you've got the pharaohs. How did you get from hunter-gatherer to the pharaohs? Well, it's a process that nobody chose. People are getting trampled, and maybe if you modify the metaphor, like who's going to get out of the room? Well, the warlords are going to be the ones that seize control. The gangsters that arose in Somalia, you can see them in the movie Mr. Phillips with Tom Hanks and Black Hawk Down. This is a world in which it's not human nature that's in the dominant position. It is the gangster. And the situation of disorder determined that that's what you were going to get. The ugliness we see in human history is a function of the selective force that acts like a magnet pulling us in the direction of power maximization, which is what the gangsters are best at. They're the ones that do really well. If everybody's going to fight to come out on top, fight to the death to come out on top, it's not random who's going to win. And it's not necessarily beneficial to humankind or gears things well to meet human needs. Takes me to the third metaphor. I don't. Doesn't exist on the web. This is my book. I think I'll go back and show the parable of the tribes. Oh, there it is. I don't have to go back all the way. So this is pages 146 to ending on top of 147, in which I'm talking about it's a section I call the fatal mismatch, because the requirements of power are playing a disproportionate role in driving how civilization develops. There is inevitably going to be a mismatch between the way the civilized societies develop and what would be optimal for meeting the needs of the human creature. I say this is inevitable, and part of the brokenness is a function of that. But I mean, there's many levels of brokenness. A war of all against all is a lot of brokenness, but also having people having to live in a society which has been designed for maximizing power in a war, in an anarchic world. How the demands that society makes of people, a society selected for the ways for its power, being internalized by the creature, who is then has to meet those demands to one degree or another, even though they're in conflict with what it was born from biological evolution just a moment ago in evolutionary time, 10, 12,000 years, we were hunter-gatherers living like primate bands, and now we got people having to meet the demands of societies that have been shaped by power. Now, if those societies, for example, like the first full-blown empires, if they are structured to have a privileged few, warlords and their descendants, the nobility or whatever, dominating, and maybe, probably, I think, in all the early empires, virtually enslaving the mass of people. Society is making demands on that mass of people that are contrary to what they're born needing for them to find fulfillment. That's a lot of brokenness. And also, when you get the gangsters dominating, gangsters, the people who can prevail in a war of all against all, they're not very whole. They tend to, there are a disproportionate number of monsters and sociopaths that do well in that situation. That's brokenness too. So I'll retire. Oh, no, I'll put it back up and I'll read this thing that I wrote. From the point of view of any one species, improvements in the natural environment are possible. The jagged edges of rocks can be smoothed, the parasites and predators deterred. Yet though improvements are possible, most environmental change is apt to be detrimental. That the natural environment falls short of perfection warrants far less emphasis than how close it comes. Genetic mutations can be favorable. That indeed is how evolution can occur. But just as the near perfection of biological design assures that the overwhelming majority of random mutations in genetic structure are detrimental, so also does it imply that most changes in a species' natural environment would be harmful rather than beneficial. But then, if the changes are also dictated by the demands of power, environmental changes have often occurred from forces extraneous to the living system, as from climatic disturbances and fluctuations. These changes have generally led to genetic adjustments by species, which is to say, the more frequent death without propagation of the original majority genotype than of a few fortunate mutants. Oh, I've just screwed up here. I apologize. I hope there's some value in hearing about there's an evolutionary perspective behind all of this. I'm quarreling here with people that were very prominent when I was first writing this stuff in the 70s and the first half of the 80s. A belief that there's no such thing as human nature, that we're a tabula rasa, that we're there for culture to write whatever it pleases. The humans there's inevitably in a cultural animal, there are a lot of plasticity. We can be shaped in a lot of directions, but that's not proof that a man lacks a substantial organismic nature. I propose the image that our flexibility is like a wire of spring steel capable of being bent in many directions, but always straining against the pressure, always trying to assume its original shape. We reach here the heart of the human dilemma. Coexistence of our natural needs and values with our unique flexibility. And this is one of the ways in which we get hoisted by our own great gifts, our inventive intelligence and our ability to adapt that has been selected for because we were we were going to be born into various cultures, and we needed to be able to fit ourselves into those cultures before the rise of civilization created all these serious problems. Adaptable to serve its own survival, to fulfill the needs of human nature. Plasticity did not arise in conflict with our given nature. Culture for ages embellished without warping the lives of human animals. But evolution cannot look ahead. It only rewards what has worked in the past. Without planning, one can fall into traps. Our capacity to learn became so great that we became capable, in René Dubos's phase, of over-adapting, of learning too well for our own good. It became possible for us to conform to an environment antagonistic to our nature. So the tabula rasa idea had the metaphor of our being this wet lump of clay is another metaphor that can be shaped however the culture wants. And then I propose spring steel to say, no, we're not completely formable by culture. We still have within us the directions in which we want to go. And that led me to this third metaphor. Yet another metaphor helps convey our condition. A metaphor more apt in some ways than either clay, moldable, or spring steel, straining to get back to its right position, for it captures our pain, the image of the bound foot of the traditional Chinese woman. We are plastic enough to develop into the stunted form that the forces imposed on us by our societies demand. But how painful not to grow into our true human shape. So that Chinese woman's foot is the metaphor. That's the third one I had in mind. Magnet, the trampling, and the Chinese woman's foot. It wasn't all Chinese women. I guess it was an aristocratic thing, and the little girls' feet would be bound. And I think that the explanation is it's sort of a sign of the prestige of the men whose women have been rendered incapable of doing much of anything. I think that's the essence of it. Thorstein Veblen, famous American sociologist, I could only give you one pretty good idea that's Veblen's. I don't remember if I ever encountered another one that impressed me as much. And his theory of the leisure class is that people are searching for prestige, and prestige is gained by men by having their women look like there's no need for them to serve any practical purpose. I think I'm simplifying his idea. I think it's broader than that. But the Chinese woman's foot, I believe, would appear in the theory of the women of the leisure class. But I'm using it to say that when I say the ugliness we see in human history is not human nature writ large, I'm also saying that when we look around the human world and see a lot of brokenness, that brokenness is a function of people being driven away from the wholeness that might naturally have unfolded in an ideal environment. keep on wrestling to understand the brokenness I see in a lot of the people that I see manifesting in the politics of a lot of people that I kind of loved when I did talk radio conversations with the conservatives out here in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley from 1992 to 2002. I see that I've been straining without success enough to satisfy me to understand just what kind of brokenness that has led to their contributing to the brokenness that they're supporting. But I think you can find the answer in terms of things that were injurious and less than ideal, that were forces applied to them in their formative process. The goodness was the result of a lot of good things that they were subjected to. But at the same time, it seems that there's a culture that sort of also created some part of exploitable module where the experience of brokenness in the family and in the wider culture and in the educational process and all that created an opening which could be exploited by certain kinds of power. That it's happened when the United States was driven to the Civil War in the 1850s, which I've studied in some depth. And I've been watching it happen since the rise of Rush Limbaugh and Newt Gingrich, that there's been an exploitation of brokenness. And it's as though if you could go back and have people nourished more fully in certain ways, then they wouldn't be subject to the kinds of things that great propagandists are able to do with people. That's my belief. I won't claim to have proven that. It's just how it seems to me that brokenness begets brokenness. And the pain of the Chinese woman's foot, I think, can be seen in today's Trumpian base. There's a lot of anger. Anger isn't the most fun thing. There's a lot of resentment. There's a lot of fear. There's a lot of need for conflict. Those things don't come from allowing the foot to grow, of this Chinese woman to grow into the foot that the genetic heritage would have had her grow from the moment that she's born to being an adult woman. Brokenness was begetting brokenness. And that's, sort of emblematic of how the human world works. That we get bent into shapes that are the shapes we get bent into that make the world more broken are connected with pain, just like the binding of a Chinese woman's foot. I think that could be argued. I don't know that I'd ever systematically tried to make that case. So let's go to these two social evolutionary developments that have empowered people to get their needs met. I've already said something here that bears upon the idea that people's needs don't. Civilization emerged in a way that wasn't all about getting people's needs met. Some anthropologists said that no hunting-gathering people went to civilization as to a greater good. I don't know if people are still saying that, but that's what I read when I was studying that stuff. And I believe that because, I said, the hunter-gatherers led, I think, a pretty decent life for the most part. And if you will go 5,000 years later and you end up with, the majority of people working as slaves, the beginnings of Cecil B. DeMille's the Ten Commandments, the guys with the whip and these slaves pulling these ropes. I mean, what kind of life was that? Who would have chosen that? And there's also evidence that their diets, you look at the skeletons, and hunter-gatherers seem to have a more healthful diet. So getting human needs met was clearly not what civilization was about. Not if a majority of people were living lives of semi-malnutrition and slaves and maybe the lash. Now, we got it better. And there can be a lot of reasons why we got it better. But two of them, first of all, my theory about the inevitability of the selection for the ways of power, that's really kind of foundational. But it's not as if I'm trying to say that human needs haven't played any role at all. I mean, I think you can count on people to do their best in the situation they are in to get their needs met. And if their needs get all twisted, then that creates problems. But there are a lot of basic needs that people want beauty, people want a certain degree of comfort and security, and probably people like being and having good relations in their families. But, there are a lot of broken people who are incapable of that. But my guess is that people are always doing what they could in that situation. It's just a situation they couldn't control. But a couple of developments in the last 2+ centuries, maybe I should go 3+, I don't know. But there's the emergence of a democracy where it's declared that the power of the state can only be wielded justly, and justice being insisted on, by the consent of the governed, the will of the people. It was only a partial step, as people often point out, privileged, landed rich white men or something. But it was a big step where the powers of the state, instead of dominating from the top and telling all you folks, you're slaves, because we've got the fist. Instead of that, here's a mechanism, the Constitution, whereby the will of the people can express itself and give power to representatives of their will to do things that will ideally serve the people and the nation as a whole. I mean, that's what it's an effort to do that. And as imperfect as it has always been, it was a big step forward. I mean, the number of people, the proportion of people, say, in the United States from 1789 with the ratification of, I think that's when the Constitution was ratified, up to the present, the proportion of people who are living lives in which their needs are being met more fully than was the case in most of the societies that were ruled top down. I think it's a big step forward. I'm not denying that there was slavery, in part of the United States. That's a major fact of American history. But the proportion of people who were living lives that were a lot better than, say, you see in the Robin Hood movies when the Normans come in and they exploit and are cruel to the Anglo-Saxons that they've conquered. They had a big improvement for a lot of people. So that's one social evolutionary development, was that after thousands of years, I mean, not that there weren't other little versions of it here and there, but after thousands of years, something was getting set up to maybe sort of solve the problem of tyranny. well, we can see in America today. You don't solve it for once and for all. I mean, that natural proclivity, if you get disorder, brokenness begetting brokenness, you can fall back into the old top-down tyranny. But at least for more than 2 centuries, we've had a world in the United States where a lot of good things could validly be said about it in comparison with the rest of the world. So that my grandparents and a lot of other people's grandparents, great-grandparents, and all, left other societies to come here for one thing, not only, but there's economic opportunity too, which we'll get to. But the, sweet land of liberty, not a complete fraud at all. It would be a shame if Americans were to vote this November without both recognizing that there's a threat to that major achievement, that it might get undone. And second, to recognize how essential that's been to so many of the blessings that generations of Americans have had for all the imperfections. And I'm not so jingoistic that I think that the United States represents, the antithesis to the parable of the tribes and the selection for power. I mean, for example, when we got here, there were other societies with completely different cultures, different language families, different family structures, different ways of living in relation to nature, different political systems, different sense of the sacred. I mean, there's a great diversity of native cultures here when the Europeans arrived. You look at the situation back in Jamestown and Plymouth Rock and the frontiers, and then the Indian Wars, Little Bighorn, all that stuff. You can see that there was a contest going on. There was a contest of a kind that has been going on since the beginnings of civilization between, and when we look at our continent now, it's obvious which side prevailed and which side is sort of marginalized, given reservations, struggling in a way that their ancestors didn't have to struggle to preserve their native languages and other aspects of their cultural identity. And here's the kicker. I mean, I am a patriotic American and admire much about our society. But it's clear that the reason that the European offshoot culture ended up dominating the continent wasn't that we persuaded the majority of people that by their will, that was the direction things were going to go. There was an ongoing struggle. There was a war of all against all because there was no order to prevent the Europeans from doing what they did on this continent. I mean, a lot of it was done by microbes that they inadvertently brought to the New World. The population got decimated by measles and other things. So it wasn't all war of one kind of society against war of another kind of society. It was also happening at a biological level with people with certain kinds of built-in immunity, inadvertently, with exceptions, eliminating the competitors for control of the continent. And then there's manifest destiny with all the rationalizations about God wants the land used this way, not the way the Indians do. They're wasting it, and then we come to capitalism. There's a mixed picture to be said about capitalism, but the first part of the picture is really to acknowledge some favorable things about it. It's a great engine for creating wealth. So if you look at per capita productivity, not that I've got any chart to show, I think that there is a takeoff in Europe where per capita wealth produced by a society increased a lot over a comparatively short period of time. Back in England at the very beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, or near the beginnings, there's Malthus, the guy who said basically that people are going to reproduce up to the point where they don't starve to death. He thought that it was impossible to raise the material level of people because reproduction will always produce enough children. I mean, he was wrong. But actually, that turned out to be an idea that, as I recall, was one of the images that enabled Charles Darwin to conceive of natural selection. That's another piece of intellectual history, that he could see that not everything survives. Malthus was very dark in that respect, and reproducing up to the point of death thinning out the herd. I'd be interested in having a good economic historian or theorist indicate whether capitalism, I think it may be said, and this is just that capitalism generates the need for consumers. I mean, I think China is actually wrestling with this right now. They have not allowed the Chinese people to consume, some economists like Paul Krugman will say, enough of the wealth they're producing, and they've lost the ability to absorb it as investment. So at some point, people living, I mean, Americans weren't living in the 19th century, up against, the margin of starvation that you might find some other places. I think it was richer, but for the average worker, the streets were hardly paved with gold. The idea of there being that the working class would also be consumers wouldn't, I don't think, dawn until there's a kind of a takeoff in the 20th century, maybe coming out of the 19th with Sears and Roebuck and the catalogs and such. But I think that eventually the rational working of the market puts money into the hands of working people. And get money, they are able to ask themselves, what do I want? I mean, further down on the economic level, what do I want? Well, I want to survive. Once you've met that need, there's nothing left to go to Disney World. And so, but as time goes on, all over the developed world, you can see capitalism putting money into people's hands, and that allowing people to ask themselves what they want and to go out into the market and buy what they want. And I think that's an important step in the right direction. There are problems with with that. I may or may not get to that in terms of the timing here. When I talk about the market as a power system, I'm also going to talk about how the market kind of warps people. It develops a power in society. The power that it develops has a motive to be used to get people to focus on meeting those needs that can be met with things that can be bought and sold. That's, whereas the religions of the ages tell us that's not really the heart of the issue about human fulfillment. I mean, things that can be bought and sold include a lot of good things. You definitely do want enough to feed yourself. And lots of other things are just plain worthwhile. But if you've got a very powerful system that's teaching people, you want to be happy, buy what we're selling. What the market is selling, and what each player on Madison Avenue is selling. You are what you drive. Well, develop your identity around this tens of $1,000s vehicle, rather than, I would say, the best way of thinking of how you develop your identity is to discover who you are at the heart of you and to live with integrity from there. But nobody gets rich off of that. So there are problems in the system. I talk about that. And in fact, I have since I'm probably not going to go there today after talking about the market some more. Let's see. Oh, yeah. This is a book that is basically devoted to how, though the market is really wonderful for a whole lot of things, which is why all the most decent societies on this planet, I think, can be said safely, make significant use of the market mechanisms that you learn in Economics 1 or 101, or that are laid out in Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, or even I'll tip my hat a little bit to Milton Friedman, who wrote Free to Choose, which basically is a piece of pro-market ideological propaganda. I think he believed it. So propaganda, maybe I shouldn't use that word. But his book was Free to Choose. All that stuff is really marvelous. And that's why everybody uses it. You put money into people's hands. You let them weigh their choices. You let the buyers and the sellers develop prices to give information. What a lot of this book, The Illusion of Choice, is about is how the information is flawed. It's very good at dealing with the information in terms of what we are as separate actors that are pursuing our own self-interest. The buyer's interests meet with the seller's interests and find a price point of supply and demand, which has got a lot of efficiency just in those terms. But the problem with the market is it's blind to all the dimensions of value that exist in our interconnections. And I'm giving the benefit of the doubt to the market. I'm not even talking about things developing monopolies and market power, or oligopolies and market power, or all the non-competitive things that have been emerging in America for the last since the 1950s with ever greater concentration. So that's really a good thing we're returning to the. I put all that aside. I'm assuming perfect competition. Exactly what Adam Smith says. Look how this invisible hand works to, in a sense, create an ideal outcome. Well, it's only ideal in certain terms. So let's turn that one off. So there are problems with the market. For example, I also don't pay any attention in that book because I want to fight and win against the market ideology, the one that say, if regulation is bad. Well, regulation is definitely necessary. The question is how to do it. There are bad ways of doing it and good ways of doing it, but not doing it just puts into the system that has its own bias and dynamic. It's like the parable of tribes. It will take a society in certain directions. I don't think that the America of today is the one that the Americans of 150 years ago would have said, yeah, well, that's what we want to look like. I think there would have been important differences. But if you don't control the market, you get driven along, just like with the parable of tribes, but in a different system. You get driven along in predictable directions. People will develop more materialistic values. Nature will be treated as though it's worthless, though it's a treasure. And you end up with industries like the asbestos industry, the tobacco industry, the fossil fuel industry, that are a lot more sociopathic as forces than people in general are. I mean, how many people do you know who would be willing to kill for money? We know that the asbestos industry was willing to kill for money. I have a friend who makes a great living for the last 40 some years as an expert witness, showing that the asbestos industry was continually hiding the truth, telling people lies, killing people because it protected their own short-term, long-term profits. And we know that the tobacco industry is willing to kill for money. So if we want to live in a more whole world, which is really the essential project that I feel like I'm part of, how do we reorder our civilization so that we can, as a species, as a civilization creating species on this planet, so that we can survive for the long haul rather than destroy ourselves through the war of all against all, developing into a nuclear holocaust maybe in our future, or through like the fossil fuel industry paralyzing us from meeting the challenge when we're so upsetting the biosphere with the climate system that we're jeopardizing the survival, or at least decent survival, of human civilization because of the brokenness of the market system. We've got a problem that one part of that problem with the market system is that we have failed to protect our political system from the capitalist system. It's okay for there to be some inequalities of wealth. I mean, I don't know exactly what it ideally would look like, and we can have incentives built into things. Not everything has to be equal. But when we go to the ballot box, it is not okay for big money, for the fossil fuel industry, for the Chamber of Commerce, for the Koch brothers organization, for the billionaire class to have a disproportionate say about where our society goes. The foundation of the nation as a constitutional democracy is, as the Supreme Court said in Baker versus Carr in '64, one person, one vote, not $1, one vote. But our democracy is poisoned by our capitalism. And the two have to be kept. We talk about separation of church and state, and that's certainly a topic worth discussing these days, not today. But there also has to be a gap between the money power, the capitalist engine, and state. It has to be the people's voice that determines what the state does and doesn't do. And only to a limited extent is that the case. Thank you for joining me today. I'll be back on Thursday. My guest then at the beginning will be another friend of mine, Bishop Dansby, who will be discussing with me, interviewing me, putting me through my paces on the question of what's at stake in the upcoming 2024 election, presidential, and I guess we can do the whole U.S. general election thing. That'll be on the 27th. It's a Thursday at 11 a.m. And I invite you to follow me, like me. I invite you to check out I claim that I've put pieces together in a coherent way that illuminates things. And I do that through all these videos, but I do it most systematically in writing, which is my craft. And if you go to abetterhumanstory.org, you'll find me laying out a lot of this stuff and showing how it's all connected and how it's all coherent. Also, if you go to my YouTube library, I should find a way to put that link there. Every time I come up here, I just do my best to show, hey, check this out. There's an integrated way of understanding our situation as species, which actually could have beneficial effects. Please just check it out. Because at the age of 78 now, I'm sort of in the fourth quarter, and I have not achieved what I want to achieve in terms of getting this thing out there well enough that it can do some good, while and not let it die with me. That's essentially the motive from which drives me now. But it's also a great pleasure to me because seeing things whole, I just find exciting, and intellectually, spiritually, the whole thing. There's really something to see. So please go take a look. Thank you. I'll be back next Thursday morning at 11. Bye-bye.